To truly grasp why ancient Romans performed certain rituals, we need to dig deep into a core fear that shaped their entire civilization. The fear of women having freedom. Forget gentle values. This empire was forged in the fires of war, built on a foundation of ironclad discipline and absolute order. Every single aspect of Roman society, from the legions marching on the frontier to the dynamics within the family home, operated under a rigid set of rules. For a Roman, order wasn't just a preference, it was the key to survival. And tradition wasn't just a quaint custom, it was the ultimate guarantee of safety. An unsettling power to sow chaos right at the heart of the family, the very building block of the state. A mother held the immense responsibility of molding the minds and characters of her children, the future leaders and citizens of Rome. This is precisely where the rituals came into play. They weren't just for show. They were powerful, psychological tools. Each step, each symbolic act, was designed to sever the bride's connection to her past. It was a process of psychological reconditioning, erasing her previous identity and preparing her for a new one identity defined by obedience, duty, and her husband's authority. These rituals were the mechanism that cemented this transfer of power, ensuring the patriarchal order remained unshaken. The name itself comes from the Latin words for with and spelt cake, a special bread made from a primitive type of wheat. This act of sharing food was deeply symbolic. This mock violence served as a stark reminder that the bride was now property being transferred. The spear in her hair, the mock abduction, being carried over the threshold was all designed to systematically dismantle her old identity. This fear and control were not just about abstract principles of order. They were deeply practical. Rome was a society obsessed with lineage and inheritance. If she were free to choose her own partners, how could a man be certain his children were his own? The entire patriarchal structure, which depended on a clear line of male descent, would crumble. The deep-seated fear never really went away. It just adapted to new circumstances, proving that for ancient Rome, the question of a woman's place was never a private matter. It was a matter of state security. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this dive into Roman social dynamics interesting, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what other aspects of daily Roman life you'd like to explore next. Have you ever looked at old wedding photos and wondered about the stories behind the traditions? Today, we're journeying back to ancient Rome to uncover a ritual that, on the surface, looked like a quiet, symbolic ceremony. Imagine a young Roman woman on her wedding day. Rome, as a society, was built on order, on structure, on the absolute authority of the state and the family patriarch. So, they engineered a ritual with a single, clear objective: to emotionally break the bride just before she entered her new home. I want to be very clear here. This wasn't about physical violence. It was something far more subtle, and perhaps more insidious. It was psychological. Every step of the ceremony was a carefully crafted message, a symbolic lesson, hammered home until it became an undeniable truth. In the bride's mind, it was a masterclass in psychological conditioning, designed to reshape her identity completely. The ritual forced the bride to accept a series of harsh new realities about her life. First, it taught her that she had no personal authority. From the moment the ceremony began, she was a passive figure. Decisions were made for her. Her movements were directed by others. This wasn't a partnership being formed. It was a transfer of ownership. Her life was no longer her own to direct. She was moving from her father's control, his asterisk, patria potestas, asterisk, directly into her husband's. The ritual made it painfully clear that her choices no longer mattered. Think about the choices you make every day, big and small. During the wedding, this was symbolized through specific actions. She would be carried over the threshold of her new home, not walking in on her own 2 feet. Next, the ritual told her that her own emotions were dangerous. Roman society valued stoicism and control, what they called asterisk gravitas. Asterisk. The bride was expected to remain composed, to suppress any fear, sadness, or even excessive joy. Her feelings were not something to be shared or validated. They were something to be managed and controlled, lest they disrupt the household's harmony. This is a heavy burden to place on someone, telling them that their very feelings are a problem. The moment she was handed over to her husband, her primary allegiance was no longer to the parents who raised her or the siblings she grew up with. Any lingering loyalty to her birth family was seen as a potential conflict of interest. She had to sever old bonds to fully embrace the new ones, a process that must have been incredibly isolating and painful. Finally, and this underpins everything else, she was taught that her duty came before her identity, who she was as a person, her talents, her quirks. Her passions were secondary to her new roles: wife and, eventually, mother. Her purpose was now defined by her function within the new family. She was there to manage the household, to be a loyal partner, and most importantly, to produce legitimate heirs, to continue her husband's family line. Her personal identity was expected to dissolve into her duties. Every single gesture, every symbol within this ancient ceremony, was meticulously designed. From the flame she carried from her father's hearth to her new home, symbolizing the transfer of her domestic duties, to the wool and spindle she was given, representing her new life of domestic labor. It was all a form of psychological pressure, calculated to crush her sense of self just enough. Not completely, of course. They needed her to be a competent household manager. A compliant wife meant a peaceful home. A peaceful home meant a strong family, and strong families were the bedrock of the entire Roman Empire. But let's step out of the Roman mindset and into the bride's shoes for a moment. For her, this ceremony wasn't protection. Imagine the profound sense of loss, the quiet grief for the person she used to be, all happening on a day that was supposed to be a celebration. It as a stark reminder that history and its traditions often have a much darker side than the storybooks tell us. So the next time you see a tradition, maybe ask yourself, where did this come from? What was its original purpose? Because sometimes, the most beautiful ceremonies hide the harshest truths. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, consider liking the video and subscribing for more journeys into the hidden corners of history. See you next time. Before the ceremony, the bride is led away, not to a room filled with laughter and excitement, but to a small, stark chamber. This room is deliberately plain, no decorations, no comforts, nothing to distract her from what's to come. The only people allowed inside are the elder women of the community, the ones who have already walked this path, who have endured this very ritual and survived its deep emotional toll. Their purpose isn't to comfort her, not to offer reassuring words or warm hugs. They are here to prepare her. But their preparation involves a systematic dismantling of her inner strength, a stripping away of her spirit. Their voices are cold, almost mechanical, as they begin their litany of commands. Do not speak unless you are asked a question. Keep your head lowered at all times. Show no hesitation in your actions. Your personal feelings do not matter anymore. This is for the honor of your family. These phrases are not just spoken once. They are repeated over and over, a relentless chant that seeps into her consciousness, designed to be absorbed until they become an inseparable part of her being. The repetition is a form of conditioning, erasing her own thoughts and replacing them with a new set of rules for existence. Her physical transformation begins. Her hair is intricately styled, not for beauty, but in a specific way that symbolizes obedience and submission. Her dress is simple, devoid of color or adornment. There is no lace, no sparkle, nothing that celebrates her individuality. The intention is to make her look humble, silent, and completely controlled. She is being molded into a symbol, not a person. Then, the elder women begin to instruct her on the gestures she must perform during the main ritual. Each action is precise, each movement loaded with meaning. First, the act of lowering her head, a physical manifestation of humility and deference. Then, offering her hands, palms up, a gesture of surrender and acceptance. Next, the breaking of bread, an act that signifies her new role in providing for a family, but also the breaking of her own will. And finally, the most chilling gesture, turning away from a mirror. This act symbolizes the final letting go of her former self, a refusal to see the person she once was. None of these gestures are physically painful. There is no violence, no overt cruelty, but the emotional weight they carry is immense, designed to leave an indelible mark on her psyche, a scar she will carry for the rest of her life. These are not just movements, they are powerful psychological anchors, tying her to a new reality. The reaction among the brides varies, but the underlying emotion is the same. Many cry, silent tears streaming down their faces as they listen to the cold instructions. Some tremble uncontrollably, a physical reaction to the immense psychological pressure. Others simply stare at the floor, their eyes vacant, having already accepted their fate without a word of protest. A quiet resignation hangs heavy in the air, but in that cold, empty room, every single bride comes to a profound and chilling understanding. This ritual, this entire process, is not a celebration of love or the beginning of a joyous union. It has nothing to do with the bond between two people. Its true purpose is far more sinister. It is a ceremony of transformation, a meticulous process designed to break her spirit and reshape her very soul. It is the death of the woman she was, and the birth of the woman she is now required to be. It is not about celebrating a marriage. It is about enforcing a tradition that values control over connection and obedience over love. The silence in the room is not peaceful. It is the sound of a spirit being carefully and deliberately unmade. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing for more explorations into the traditions that shape our world. We'll see you in the next video. The Floralia Festival in ancient Rome. A time of flowers, festivities, and public humiliation for new brides. It sounds shocking, but for many Roman women, this ancient ritual was a deeply traumatic experience, a stark reminder of their place in a patriarchal society. Let's peel back the layers of this bizarre and unsettling tradition. Imagine you're a young Roman woman, just married. Your family has arranged everything. You're supposed to be starting a new life, full of hope and promise. But first, there's a tradition you must endure. The Floralia. This festival dedicated to the goddess Flora was known for its wild, licentious celebrations. Think theatrical performances, games, and an abundance of flowers. Sounds lovely, right? But for newly married women, it held a darker side. On a designated day during the festival, new brides were brought to a public stage. They were stripped of their modest matronly robes and forced to wear the revealing, brightly colored garments of a courtesan or a meretrix. This wasn't just a change of clothes, it was a symbolic stripping of their identity. The stola, the traditional dress of a respected Roman matron, signified dignity and virtue. To have it replaced with the attire of a prostitute in front of everyone was a profound public degradation. But the humiliation didn't stop there. On stage, these young women were subjected to a barrage of lewd jokes, catcalls, and invasive gazes from the raucous crowd. Men would shout obscene comments, evaluating their bodies as if they were livestock at a market. Sometimes, they were even forced to perform suggestive dances or skits, further blurring the line between a respected wife and a public entertainer. This wasn't a celebration of their new marital status, it was a ritualized shaming. Why would a society that prized female chastity so highly subject its newly married women to such a degrading spectacle? The official explanation was that it was a fertility rite, an appeal to the goddess Flora to bless the new marriage with children. By temporarily taking on the persona of a loose woman, the bride was thought to shed any bad luck or evil spirits that might threaten her fertility. It was a symbolic act of appeasing the gods to ensure the continuation of the family line. But many historians see a much more sinister motive at play. This ritual was a powerful tool of social control. In a society where men held all the power, the Floralia served as a brutal reminder to women of their subordinate status. It was a way of saying, no matter your family's wealth or your personal virtue, we can publicly shame you. Your body is not your own. It is subject to public scrutiny and judgment. It was a demonstration of male power, a way to keep women in a constant state of fear and submission. The trauma of the Floralia didn't end when the bride stepped off the stage. For many women, this moment changed how others looked at them forever. In Roman families, a woman's value came from her purity, her obedience, and her ability to produce children. But now, after being forced to stand in public, dressed like a prostitute after being inspected, laughed at, and touched by strangers, she returned home with a new label. People whispered, relatives stared, even servants might make cruel jokes behind her back. The bride often felt like she had lost something that could never be restored: her dignity, her sense of safety. Roman writers and poets described the aftermath. Many young brides would cry for days following the ceremony. They felt a deep sense of anger, shame, and confusion. They were left asking themselves questions that had no easy answers. Why was this done to me? Did I do something to deserve this? Is this what being a wife means? These questions haunted them because the ritual was never designed to make sense to them. It wasn't about respect or celebration. It was designed to control them, to instill a deep-seated insecurity that would make them more pliable, more obedient wives. By publicly associating the bride with the meretrix, the ritual created a psychological link. It was a warning: step out of line, be disobedient, or fail to produce an heir. And this public shame is what you risk. Your reputation is fragile, and we, the men of Rome, hold the power to destroy it at any moment. Think about the psychological impact. A young woman has told her entire life that her virtue is her most precious asset. Then, at the very moment she is meant to be celebrated as a chaste and respectable wife, she is publicly branded with the opposite image. It's a classic case of a double bind, a no-win situation designed to create anxiety and dependence. This brings us to a broader point about Roman society. While we often romanticize Rome for its engineering, its laws, and its philosophy, we must also confront its darker side. The lives of women, even those from the upper classes, were heavily constrained. They were legal minors their entire lives, always under the authority of a male guardian, first their father, then their husband. They couldn't vote, hold public office, or even control their own finances. Their primary purpose was to marry well and produce legitimate heirs for their husband's family. The Floralia ritual was just one, albeit extreme example of how this patriarchal system was enforced. It was a raw, visceral display of power that went beyond laws and social customs. It targeted a woman's very sense of self. Interestingly, not all women in Rome were subjected to this. The ritual was primarily for brides from respectable families. This distinction is crucial. It wasn't about punishing fallen women. It was about controlling good ones. It was a way of preemptively reminding them of the boundaries they were never to cross. As Rome evolved, so did its traditions. Over the centuries, especially with the rise of Christianity, which had a very different view of marriage and female modesty, rituals like the bride's ordeal at the Floralia began to fade away. The public, state-sanctioned shaming of women in this manner became less acceptable, but the underlying attitudes about female subordination and the control of women's bodies lingered for centuries. And in some ways, echoes of these power dynamics can still be seen in societies around the world today. The story of the Floralia brides is a haunting one. It's a powerful reminder that history is not just about great battles and famous emperors. It's also about the quiet, personal struggles of ordinary people, especially those whose voices were silenced. It forces us to look beyond the marble statues and grand amphitheaters and see the human cost of a society built on inequality. It's a stark lesson in how tradition can be weaponized, and how public rituals can be used not to unite people, but to enforce a brutal hierarchy. So the next time you see a depiction of a Roman festival with its flowers and joyful crowds, remember the young brides on the stage. Remember their fear, their shame, and their confusion. Their story is a vital part of Rome's history, a chapter that reminds us to question traditions and to always look for the power dynamics hidden beneath the surface of celebration. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into the dark side of Roman history interesting, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge what you thought you knew about the past. See you next time. Think Roman weddings were all about the bride? Think again. While she was enduring her own public ordeal, the groom was trapped in a very different kind of test, one that happened behind closed doors. On the surface, Roman men had all the freedom and power, but on his wedding night, a groom was expected to prove one thing above all else: his dominance. Imagine this. You're the groom, the celebrations are winding down. You're about to begin your new life. But before that, you have to sit through a series of pep talks from your older male relatives. Uncle Marcus pulls you aside, his voice low and serious. Show her you are in control from the very first moment. Then your father-in-law claps you on the shoulder, a little too hard. You must break her fear tonight. A wife must learn to obey. Another cousin chimes in. She must obey you from this day forward. Don't be soft. These weren't suggestions. They were instructions. It was a cultural script he was expected to follow without question, and it didn't stop with the serious lectures. The groom's friends, fueled by wine and wedding festivities, would gather around him. They'd start making jokes, but these weren't your typical, light-hearted wedding jokes. They were crude, often violent, and deeply disturbing. They'd joke about what a man should do to assert his power on the wedding night, describing acts of force and intimidation. The subtext was crystal clear. Your new wife is property, and tonight is when you brand her as yours. The pressure to perform this act of dominance was immense. Now, not every Roman groom was a monster eagerly waiting to assert his power. The reality was far more complex. Some men, listening to these crude jokes and stern lectures, felt a deep sense of discomfort. They might have genuinely cared for their new bride and found these expectations repulsive. They were trapped. To reject this advice was to risk being seen as weak, as less of a man, by their peers and family. They were caught between their own conscience and the immense weight of societal expectation. Other grooms might have felt a different kind of pressure. They might have bought into the ideology, but felt anxious about their ability to live up to it. Could they be as dominant as everyone expected? What if they failed this crucial first test of manhood? This anxiety wasn't about love or partnership. It was about performance and status. They were worried about failing a cultural exam, one with very real social consequences. The wedding night became less about union and more about a high-stakes performance of masculinity. And of course, as some grooms did embrace this role, they felt entitled, excited by the prospect of wielding this power. They saw the wedding night as their right, a culmination of everything they'd been taught about a man's place in the world. For them, the lectures and jokes simply reinforced a worldview they already held. They saw their bride not as a partner, but as a conquest. So, while the bride was being publicly paraded and symbolically stripped of her old identity outside, the groom was inside, waiting. It was a bundle of conflicting emotions: anxiety, excitement, confusion, maybe even dread. The specific feeling depended on the man, his personality, and his own beliefs. But Rome had constructed a system where even the seemingly powerful were trapped. Men were caught inside a rigid framework of masculinity, forced to perform roles they may not have fully believed in. This reveals a darker, more nuanced truth about Roman society. It wasn't just a simple patriarchy where men were on top and women were at the bottom. It was a complex web of expectations that ensnared everyone. The system was designed to maintain a certain power structure, and it did so by policing the behavior of both men and women, right from the very first night of their marriage. The wedding night, therefore, wasn't just a celebration of love or the beginning of a family. For both the bride and the groom, it was fundamentally a test. For her, it was a test of submission. For him, it was a test of dominance. It was a carefully orchestrated piece of social theater designed to establish the power dynamic that would define their entire marriage. It was the night Rome's ideals were brutally enforced, setting the stage for a lifetime where control, not companionship, was the ultimate goal. The pressure was on, and for both of them, failure was not an option. Thanks for watching. If you found this look into the hidden side of Roman history interesting, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the past. We'll see you in the next one. Ever wonder what the final step was for a bride in ancient Rome before she could officially be called a wife? It wasn't the kiss, or even the vows. It was a tradition, performed right at the doorway of her new home, that was both deeply symbolic and, for many, deeply disturbing. This single moment was meant to represent the complete transformation from a daughter under her father's roof to a wife under her husband's authority. It was a powerful, and often physical, statement about power, control, and ownership in Roman society. So, what exactly happened on that threshold? Let's pull back the curtain on this final, unsettling ritual of a Roman wedding. After the public ceremonies, the feasting, and the noisy procession through the streets, the bride and her new husband finally arrived at his house. This was the moment everyone was waiting for, the grand finale of the day's events. But she couldn't just walk in. Before she crossed the threshold into a new life, Roman tradition demanded a strange and theatrical performance. This wasn't about celebration. It was about demonstrating a fundamental shift in power. First, she was expected to enact a scene of resistance. She had to pretend to be unwilling, to hesitate, and hold back from entering the house. Imagine how this must have felt for the bride. After a long day of public rituals, surrounded by a crowd of her husband's family and friends, she was forced to participate in a play that symbolized her own subjugation. For some, whose families treated it as a light-hearted custom, it might have been a minor, if awkward, moment. But for many others, it was genuinely frightening and humiliating. The force used could be real, the symbolism was potent, and the experience could be deeply unsettling. This ritual was the final, indelible line drawn between her old life and her new one. The moment she was carried or pushed across that threshold, she was no longer her father's daughter. She was now, in the eyes of Roman law and society, a part of her husband's property, his possession. This tradition, known as deductio, in Duma Mariti, the leading of the bride into the husband's house, wasn't just a quirky old custom. It was a cornerstone of how Romans understood marriage. The physical act of crossing the threshold under duress was a legal and social transfer of authority. Before this moment, she was under the patria potestas, the power of her father. This gave him significant legal control over her property, and any children they would have. Every step was carefully choreographed to reinforce her new status. She was now a matrona, a Roman wife, with all the duties and limitations that title entailed. The world she knew just moments before, standing on the other side of that door, was gone forever. One minute you were a daughter, the next you were a wife. This ritual served as a public and legal marker of that change. It highlights the vast differences in cultural values and the evolution of marriage over the centuries. What was once a standard and expected part of a wedding is now seen as a symbol of oppression. It is a powerful reminder that the traditions we take for granted are always shaped by the societies that create them. The Roman bride's journey over the threshold was not just a step into a new house, but a step into an entirely new identity, one that was chosen for her and enforced by the power of tradition. What do you think about this ancient Roman tradition? Does it change your perspective on how we view marriage today? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and if you found this piece of history as fascinating as I did, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more dives into the past. See you next time. Forget everything you know about romantic wedding nights. No candlelit dinners, no sweet whispers, no tender embraces. For a young woman in ancient Rome, this night was the terrifying culmination of a day filled with public humiliation and private fear. Let us pull back the curtain on one of history's most misunderstood rituals, and explore why the Roman wedding night was less about love and more about a cold, silent duty. Imagine you're a Roman girl, maybe only 13 or 14 years old. You've just been paraded through the streets, your childhood home and family now a memory. You've been handed over to a man you barely know, in a house that isn't yours. The celebrations, filled with raucous songs and crude jokes at your expense, have finally died down. The guests are gone, and now you're alone with your new husband in the marital chamber. The lectus genialis. Silence. A thick, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of your own heart pounding in your chest. This wasn't a moment of shared intimacy. For the bride, it was a moment of profound dread. She had been raised to believe her primary purpose was to bear children, specifically legitimate heirs for her husband's family. Her body was seen not as her own, but as a vessel, a tool for procreation. Her feelings, her comfort, her desires, they were completely irrelevant. The concept of consent as we understand it today simply did not exist in this context. The marriage contract was a transaction, and this night was its final, non-negotiable clause. The public rituals leading up to this moment were designed to strip her of her old identity. One of the most symbolic acts was the parting of the bride's hair with a spearhead. While some scholars suggest it symbolized a transfer of authority, it was also a stark and somewhat violent reminder of her new subservient role. Then came the procession to the groom's house, where she was carried over the threshold. This wasn't to be romantic. It was a precaution. A bride stumbling would have been a terrible omen, a sign of her unsuitability, and a potential curse on the household. So, she was lifted less like a cherished partner and more like a fragile, but valuable, piece of property being delivered. Throughout this ordeal, the bride was expected to show modesty and reluctance, even weeping. This was a performance of virginal innocence, a societal script she had to follow. But beneath the performance, genuine terror was almost certainly brewing. She was unprepared, uneducated about what was to come. Roman society was deeply private about such matters, and it's unlikely her mother would have offered any practical advice beyond telling her to endure it for the sake of the family. She was stepping into the unknown, with the weight of two families' futures resting on her shoulders. And what about the groom? It's easy to cast him as the villain, but his reality was also complicated. He, too, was under immense pressure. He might be a young man himself, just as nervous and inexperienced as his bride. His family, his father in particular, expected him to complete the marriage. This act wasn't just personal, it was a public duty. It legitimized the union and started the clock on the all-important production of an heir. Failure to perform would bring shame not just on him, but on his entire lineage. He had to prove his virility, to assert his dominance as the new head of this small household unit. His own feelings of awkwardness, or even compassion for his terrified young wife, were secondary to the crushing weight of expectation. So, the bedroom was not a sanctuary of love. It was a stage for a final, obligatory act, an act of possession. The groom asserted his legal right over his wife's body, and the wife submitted to her fate. There was no room for tenderness when the goal was so clinical. The consummation of a contract and the potential creation of an heir. It was the last step in a long, ritualistic process, designed by a patriarchal society that valued control, lineage, and property above all else. Compassion and personal connection were luxuries that had no place in this stark transaction. The morning after offered no relief. The bride was now a matrona, a married woman. Her new life had begun, one that would be defined by domestic duties and the pressure to conceive. If she was lucky, her husband might be a kind man, and over the years, a genuine affection might grow. Many Roman couples did develop deep and loving bonds, but that potential future was a distant hope on this first, frightening night. The foundation of their marriage wasn't laid in love, but in a silent, awkward, and often terrifying ritual. It's a sobering reminder that our modern ideas about marriage, love, and intimacy are just that modern. For much of history, marriage was a practical arrangement, an alliance between families. The Roman wedding night starkly illustrates this reality. It was a private moment shaped by public pressures, a silent encounter filled with unspoken fear, and a duty performed in the name of legacy, not love. It was the final, chilling piece of a societal puzzle that saw women as instruments and men as executors of a dynastic plan, a far cry from the romance we see in movies. It was the cold, hard reality for countless young people in the ancient world. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this glimpse into the past as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what other aspects of daily Roman life you'd like to explore next. See you in the next video. Imagine this. The confetti is settled, the guests have gone home, and the wedding festivities are over. For many brides in ancient Rome, what followed wasn't a honeymoon, but a harsh and difficult truth. When they tried to speak about their traumatic wedding nights, they were met with a wall of silence. It was tradition, their families would say. Everyone goes through it, just don't talk about it. But how do you simply forget something that has deeply wounded you? Forgetting was impossible. This silence became a heavy burden that countless Roman women carried for the rest of their lives. They bore the trauma of their wedding night in secret, a pain they never shared, not with their husbands, who were often part of that tradition, not with their friends, and, perhaps, most tragically, not with their own daughters, who would one day face the same ritual, completely unprepared. This created a cycle of hidden suffering, passed down from mother to daughter without a single word of warning or comfort. Years, even centuries later, when Roman society began to change and historians tried to erase this brutal ritual from the official records, they inadvertently erased the stories of these women as well. The people who live through these events are forever changed, but it doesn't stop with them. The stress, the fear, the coping mechanisms they develop are often passed down to their children, not through genetics, but through behavior, through the stories they don't tell, and through the very atmosphere of the home. A parent who survived a war might be overly protective or have a hair-trigger temper, behaviors their children absorb and carry into their own lives, often without understanding the origin. This is why understanding history is so much more than just memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding people. It's about recognizing the deep, emotional currents that flow beneath the surface of events. We're looking at the birth of a trauma that would ripple through Roman society for centuries. We're seeing how personal pain, when silenced, becomes a collective burden. The stories of these women were lost, but their legacy of pain endured. It became part of the fabric of family life, an unspoken rule book of what could and could not be discussed. Daughters grew up sensing a tension they couldn't name, a sorrow they couldn't trace. They learned to be silent, just as their mothers had. They learned that some things are too painful to speak of, and so the cycle continued. The weight of the past pressed down on the present, shaping relationships and expectations in subtle but powerful ways. It's a sobering reminder that what we ignore doesn't go away. The stories that are suppressed, the pain that is dismissed, it all finds a way to survive. It lives on in our families, in our communities, and in ourselves. When the women of Rome were told to forget, their society wasn't just asking them to erase a memory. It was asking them to swallow a poison that would slowly leak out and affect generations to come. Their silence was not peace. It was the quiet transmission of pain. And this brings us to a powerful question for our own lives. What are the unspoken stories in our families? What traditions or events have left their mark, even if no one talks about them? The past is never truly past. It lives within us, in the stories we tell, and, more importantly, in the ones we don't. Thank you for watching. If this story resonates with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden side of history. Have you ever wondered what happens when a powerful empire becomes ashamed of its own past? What secrets do they try to bury? Today, we re-diving deep into the fascinating and often disturbing story of how ancient Rome tried to erase a piece of its own history. We're talking about the Floralia, a festival that was far more than just flowers. Stick around, because this story reveals a powerful truth about society, memory, and power. Let's set the scene. Imagine the Roman Empire at its peak. It's a sprawling, powerful entity, known for its legions, its aqueducts, and its complex legal system. But it also had a wild side, a side rooted in ancient rituals that were often brutal and deeply symbolic. The Floralia was one of these. As we've discussed before, this festival wasn't just a spring celebration. It was a raw, visceral display of power, a ritualistic humiliation of conquered peoples, particularly those from Carthage. It involved forced public degradation, mock battles where the defeated were always the same, and a celebration of Roman dominance in its most primal form. For centuries, this was an accepted, even celebrated, part of Roman life. It was a reminder to everyone, from the citizens in the capital to the furthest reaches of the empire, of who was in charge. It reinforced the social and political hierarchy with stark, unforgettable imagery. But empires, like people, change. As centuries passed, Rome itself began to evolve. The political landscape shifted, and most importantly, a new religious force began to take hold. Christianity. This wasn't just a change in worship. It was a fundamental shift in morality and what it meant to be civilized. The old gods, and their often chaotic, violent, and highly sexualized rituals started to look less like sacred tradition and more like embarrassing, immoral behavior. Suddenly, the Rome that wanted to project an image of itself as a bastion of law, order, and Christian virtue had a major PR problem. And that problem was its own history. The Floralia, with its themes of cruelty, public humiliation, and overt sexuality, became a glaring stain on this new, carefully constructed identity. It was a skeleton in the empire's closet, a noisy, rattling reminder of a past that no longer fit the official narrative. So what does a massive empire do when it feels uncomfortable about its own past? It gets out the eraser. The raw, brutal details were softened or removed entirely. The second step was to completely rebrand the festivals. Meaning, the ritual that was once a clear symbol of military domination and the subjugation of enemies was suddenly, the focus shifted away from conquest and humiliation. And what was this new, sanitized version? The Floralia became simply a festival of flowers. The name itself, which once had deeper, more complex connotations, was taken literally. Official accounts began to emphasize the floral decorations, the springtime renewal, and the worship of Flora, the goddess of flowers and fertility. This religious condemnation provided the moral justification for the state's historical revisionism. It wasn't just about political image anymore. It was a holy crusade against a corrupt past. This dual pressure, from both the state and the church, was incredibly effective. When the most powerful institutions in a society agree that something needs to disappear from memory, it's amazing how quickly it can be forgotten. For centuries, this sanitized version of the Floralia was the accepted truth. The story of a simple flower festival became the official history. The real, brutal ritual was almost completely lost. But history has a funny way of surviving. It clings on in fragments, in forgotten texts, in overlooked footnotes. Much later, historians began to piece together the puzzle. They found small mentions and descriptions in older writings that had somehow survived the purge. Ever wondered what a Roman wedding was really like? We often picture romantic scenes, beautiful gowns, and celebrations of love. But the truth is far more complex and, frankly, quite chilling. The story of the Roman wedding isn't about romance. It's a story about power. It's about how an empire used tradition to control, to dominate, and to maintain its rigid social order. It's a story that Rome itself tried to bury because it reveals a darkness that contradicts its claims of being the greatest civilization on Earth. So, let's pull back the curtain on this ancient ceremony. Forget what you've seen in movies. We're going to explore how these rituals were designed not to celebrate a union of two hearts, but to methodically transfer ownership of a woman from her father to her husband. It was a public spectacle engineered to teach one crucial lesson. A woman's life, her body, her very identity, now belonged to Rome. The process began long before the wedding day, with the betrothal, This wasn't a romantic proposal. It was a business contract, a legal agreement between two men. The bride's father, the paterfamilias, and her future husband. The bride herself often had little to no say in the matter. She might be a child, sometimes as young as 7, when she was promised away. The focus was on alliances, property, and the continuation of family lines. The groom would give an iron ring, an annulus, pronobus, to his future bride. It wasn't a symbol of love, but a symbol of the binding contract, a down payment on a future acquisition. This wasn't a promise of partnership. It was the first link in a chain of ownership. On the eve of her wedding, the bride-to-be performed a deeply symbolic ritual. She would gather her childhood toys, her dolls, her games, all the tokens of her youth, and offer them to the lares, the household gods of her father's home. This act was a formal farewell to her childhood. It signified that she was no longer a child under her father's protection. She was leaving that identity behind forever. At the same time, she would take off her toga praetexta, the simple garment worn by children, and put on the tunica recta, the traditional wedding tunic. This change of clothing was a powerful visual statement. She was being stripped of her old self to be remade into a new one, a wife. The wedding day itself was a masterclass in symbolic theater. The bride's appearance was meticulously crafted. Her hair was parted into 6 locks with a spearhead, a symbol of ancient martial tradition, perhaps hinting at the forceful nature of this union. She wore a bright yellow veil, the flammeum, which obscured her face, rendering her anonymous. She was not an individual, but a symbol, a bride, an object being transferred. Over a tunic, she wore a girdle tied in a special knot, the knot of Hercules. This knot was significant because only the husband was allowed to untie it on the wedding night, a clear and public declaration of his exclusive sexual rights over her. The ceremony, the didaxio, in Doma Mariti, was the public procession from her father's house to her husband's. This wasn't a quiet walk. It was a noisy, chaotic, and sometimes violent spectacle. The procession was accompanied by flute players, torchbearers, and a crowd shouting lewd and raucous jokes. The bride would be symbolically abducted from her mother's arms. This was a staged reenactment of the legendary rape of the Sabine women, the foundational myth of Rome where the city's founders stole their wives from a neighboring tribe. By embedding this act of violence into the wedding ritual, Rome was normalizing the idea that marriage was, at its core, an act of capture, a man taking a woman by force. It sent a clear message to everyone watching. This is how our society began, and this is how it will continue. As the procession moved through the streets, the crowd's role was crucial. Their body songs and jokes, often targeted at the couple, served to strip the moment of any personal intimacy. This was a public affair, a community event that reinforced social norms. The bride was not a private individual entering a personal relationship. She was a public commodity being integrated into a new family line for the benefit of the state. Upon reaching her husband's home, the bride faced another set of rituals designed to underscore her new status. She would anoint the doorposts with oil and wool, symbols of her future domestic duties, but she would not walk through the door herself. Instead, she was lifted over the threshold by her husband or his attendants. Why? The official reason was to prevent her from tripping, which was considered a bad omen, but the deeper, unspoken reason was one of control. She did not enter her new home of her own free will. She was carried into it, powerless, like an object. Her first entry into her new life was an act of submission. Once inside, her husband would offer her fire and water, the essential elements of a household. This gesture symbolized her acceptance into the new home, but it was also a reminder of her role. She was now the keeper of the hearth, responsible for managing the domestic sphere. The ceremony culminated with the bride speaking the traditional words, Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, which translates to where you are Gaius. I am Gaia. On the surface, it sounds like a declaration of unity, but in the context of Roman law and society, it was a profound statement of submission. It meant, your identity is now my identity. Your family is my family. Your life is my life. She was erasing her past, her lineage, her very name, to become an extension of her husband. Gaia was not a specific name. It was a generic placeholder for wife, just as Gaius was for husband. She became the universal wife, defined entirely by her relationship to him. And what of the knot of Hercules? That final act, performed in the privacy of the wedding chamber, was the ultimate consummation of the power transfer. The husband's untang of the knot was the symbolic and literal assertion of his authority over her body. The ritual, from start to finish, was a relentless process of erasing one identity and imposing another. It was a system designed to protect male authority at all costs. The woman was taught her place, and society was reminded of the unshakable patriarchal order. So why would Rome want to bury this? Because it exposes the hypocrisy at the heart of the empire. Rome projected an image of law, order, and civilization. It called itself the pinnacle of human achievement, but its foundational rituals for family and society were built on principles of coercion, capture, and the subjugation of half its population. The wedding ceremony wasn't a celebration of love. It was a psychological conditioning tool. It silenced the bride, stripped her of her agency, and remade her into a vessel for procreation and domestic labor, all for the good of the state. The suffering of countless women who went through this process was deemed irrelevant. Their feelings, their happiness, their desires, none of it mattered in the grand calculus of Roman power. The ritual taught a woman that her life was not her own, and this is the truth, that the empire, with all its grand histories and monuments, it is the story of how a culture that prided itself on justice built its homes on a foundation of injustice. The Roman wedding wasn't just a ceremony, it was a weapon, and understanding it reveals the true, often brutal, face of Roman power. It's a sobering reminder that behind the grand narratives of history, there are always hidden stories of control and a high price paid by those who had no voice. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the darker side of Roman history. If you found this fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into the stories that history tried to forget. See you next time. Ever wonder what a Roman wedding was really like? We often picture this very grand, very romantic ceremony, right? A beautiful bride in a white tunic, a flame-colored veil, and a wreath of flowers. It sounds picturesque, but behind this image, there's a story that's far more complex, and frankly, a lot darker than we're usually told. It's a story of tradition, of duty, and for many women, a story of resistance. Let's step back in time, to ancient Rome. A wedding wasn't just about two people falling in love. For the Roman elite, it was a strategic alliance, a business deal between two families, and at the center of this transaction was the bride. Often, she was just a teenager, sometimes as young as 12. Her voice, her desires, her dreams, they were rarely part of the equation. Her father, the paterfamilias, held absolute power. He chose her husband, he negotiated the dowry, and he decided her future. The wedding day itself was a series of deeply symbolic, and frankly, quite intense rituals. On the eve of her wedding, a young woman would dedicate her childhood toys and her maiden's tunic to toga, praetexta to the household gods. It was a formal goodbye to her childhood, a severing of her old identity. The next morning, she would be dressed by her mother in the tunica recta, the straight tunic, woven on a traditional loom. It was fastened with a special woolen belt tied in the knot of Hercules, a knot so intricate only the groom was meant to untie it. This symbolized his claim over her, his new authority. Her hair would be parted into 6 locks, using a spearhead, a symbol of a violent past, perhaps recalling the legendary abduction of the Sabine women. Over this, she wore a bright, flame-colored veil, the flammium, meant to make her look like a flickering flame, and a wreath of verbena and marjoram, flowers she had to gather herself. Each element was steeped in tradition. Each one a link in the chain, binding her to her new role. The ceremony, the didukio, was a public spectacle. The bride was symbolically abducted from her mother's arms. This wasn't a gentle leading. It was a performance of force. A procession would then lead her through the streets to her new home. People would shout coarse, often rude, jokes and songs. It was meant to be a way to ward off evil spirits, but imagine how a young girl, probably terrified, would feel in that moment. When she arrived at her new home, she wasn't just welcomed in. She had to anoint the doorposts with oil and wool, symbols of her future domestic duties. Then, she was lifted over the threshold by the groom's attendants. Why? To avoid the bad omen of her tripping. But it was also another symbolic act of being carried into a new life. A life where she no longer had control over her own steps. Once inside, the groom would offer her fire and water, the essentials of a household, and she would say the famous line, Ubi to Gaius. Ego Gaia. Where you are, Gaius, I am Gaia. This phrase, often romanticized, was essentially a pledge of total submission. She was erasing her old self to become his counterpart. Her identity was now tied entirely to his. She was no longer the daughter of her father. She was the wife of her husband. Her legal and social existence was transferred. Now, history, written mostly by men, tends to paint a picture of quiet acceptance. We're led to believe that every young Roman woman went through this, compliant and silent. But that's not the whole truth. It can't be. Human nature doesn't work that way. We have to read between the lines to look at the subtext of the rituals themselves. Why was there a need for a mock abduction? Why the need to physically lift her over the threshold? These rituals suggest that a woman's reluctance was expected. The performance of force was built into the ceremony itself, almost as if to preempt and overpower any resistance she might show. And we know they did resist. Not all Roman brides accepted their fate quietly. Think about it. These were young women, full of life, with their own thoughts and feelings. To be suddenly handed over to a stranger, sometimes a man much older than her, to be moved to a new house, a new family, under a new authority. It must have been terrifying. It's only natural that some would fight back. We don't have a library of diaries from Roman teenage girls. History, for the most part, didn't bother to record the names of women who suffered or rebelled in private. Their stories were seen as unimportant, domestic dramas not worthy of the grand narratives of wars and politics. But their resistance existed. We can be sure of it. Some would have resisted, verbally. Imagine a young bride arguing with her father, pleading with her mother. She might have cried. She might have screamed. She might have pointed out the flaws in her proposed husband, his age, his reputation. These arguments would have happened behind the closed doors of a Roman villa, but they happened. Others might have resisted through passive non-compliance. Maybe she refused to gather the flowers for her wreath. Maybe she didn't say the lines of the vows with the required enthusiasm. Maybe, during the procession, she didn't play her part as the blushing, modest bride. Maybe her silence was a weapon, her sullenness a protest. An ancient text might describe a bride as shy or demure, but could that have been a historian's interpretation of a young woman who was actually frozen with fear and defiance? And some might have fought back more directly. In a world where she had no legal power, her body was her last domain of control. There are hints in Roman literature of brides who refused to be dressed, who fought against the elaborate and symbolic hairdressing, who struggled when they were abducted from their mother's embrace. They might have refused to anoint the doorposts. They might have purposefully stumbled at the threshold, a small act of defiance against the carefully constructed symbolism of the day. We know these women existed. We know they tried. Their names are lost to us. They are the footnotes of history, the anonymous figures in the background of a story dominated by men. But their spirit is not entirely lost. Every time a tradition is questioned, every time an expectation is challenged, we are echoing their struggle. The survival of these stories, even as fragmented rituals, is a testament to them. The reason we know about the mock abduction, the reason we know about lifting the bride over the threshold, is partly because these acts were designed to overcome a woman's presumed unwillingness. The ritual itself contains the ghost of her resistance. So, when we look back at the Roman bride, let's see more than just a girl in a pretty veil. Let's see the teenager who was bartered like property. Let's see the young woman forced to perform her own submission, but let's also look for the flicker of defiance in her eyes. Let's remember the ones who argued, who refused, who fought. History rarely writes down the names of women who suffer in silence, and it is even less likely to record the names of those who dared to speak up. But they were there. They endured. They survived. And by remembering their struggle, we honor them. We refuse to let them be erased, just as they refuse to be entirely consumed by the rituals designed to silence them. Their legacy isn't written in grand monuments, but in the enduring human spirit that questions, that challenges, and that refuses to be broken. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story compelling, please give this video a like and subscribe for more hidden histories. See you next time.